Hello and welcome to You Sew You. My name's Zoe and this is my channel all about the crafty bits and pieces I get up to. I knit, I sew, I spin on a drop spindle, I dabble in weaving from time to time, and anything else that takes my crafty fancy. Now this week we are talking about the hows, whys and wherefores of blocking when you're working on a project. So grab a brew, put your feet up and let's get started. So welcome back to any returning viewers, and to any new viewers a very warm welcome to you. Now as I mentioned at the opening of the video, this week we're talking about blocking. Now, this is something I'd intended to do as a video later in the year, but as there's been a recent bit of fuss on the social medias about blocking, I thought it might be a good one to do now. So first of all, what is blocking? Well, it's a finishing technique that you use to get a project to the size that it's intended to be, and it also allows the stitches to sort of settle down and to match that where their finished state is supposed to be. So for lace, it's going to open the lace up, and for other stitches, it's all sort of even out any tension blips across the fabric and just elevate a finished item to that sort of finished state, that polished state. So that's what it is. Now, when do you do it? Okay, that depends on what you're making. If you're working on something in the flat, the pattern is most likely going to ask you to block before you seam the pieces together. If you're working on in the round, then it's going to be once the project is off the needles. And you might want to block as well after you've seamed something together. The other stage that you're going to most likely be asked to block is when you swatch. The gauge given in a pattern is usually the gauge after it's been blocked, not before. If it says before blocking, then absolutely that's when you measure it. That might be the case in some shawl patterns, for instance, where you're sort of measuring things as you go. But generally speaking, the gauge given in a pattern is post blocking. So how do you do it? Well, there's two ways. The first way is wet blocking, which is the one that most people are familiar with, and this one takes the most time because the fabric is wetter when you're actually blocking. So you're going to soak your fabric, usually in some wool wash and some sort of lukewarm water for at least 10 minutes, possibly longer. And then you're going to squeeze out as much of the water as you can, or put it in the washing machine on the spin cycle. There's no heat involved in the spin cycle, there's no detergent in there, so it's not going to cause anything to felt. So you're quite safe spinning in your washing machine, or if you have a spin dryer, you can use that. And that's going to get out the majority of the water, more than you can by squeezing alone. So that's a good option because that's going to speed things up. Once you've got out as much water as you can, you're going to then lay the item flat and potentially pin it out, particularly if you're trying to get something to match the size in the schematic. You're going to need to pin it. If you're doing something flat that's going to need to be seamed together, you're going to need to pin it to make sure that your seam lines are the same length before you seam them together. Lace is quite often pinned out as well. That's going to open up the holes in the lace and make it look how it's supposed to be looking. If it's not lace, if it's not something that needs to be seamed, if it's already pretty much the size you want it to be, you don't necessarily need to pin it. You can, but you don't necessarily need to if you don't need to sort of fiddle around with the size too much. Although obviously bear in mind some yarns do, of their own accord, stretch and lengthen and change size when you block it, which is why gauge swatches are for after blocking and not before. So that's wet blocking. The other method of blocking is steam blocking. So that's similar process, you're just not going to need to soak the fabric first. So it saves a little bit of time there. It's also going to be a little bit quicker to dry because there's less water being put into the fabric during the process. So you pin out your project or lay it flat and same as before, same as you do after you squeeze out the water in wet blocking, but you do it first in steam blocking on a surface that you can iron on. Then you're going to put something like a tea towel over the top to protect the fabric. And the important thing here is that you are not actually ironing the fabric, you're just getting the steam to go through it. So you're going to put your iron on a steam setting and hover it over the top of the fabric. You can lightly brush it across the top of the tea towel if you've covered your fabric with one, but you're not pressing down, you're not putting any pressure on. Just going to let the steam go through the fabric and that's going to do pretty much the same thing as wet blocking would be. Benefit being that it's not going to get as much water into the fabric, so it's not going to take as long to dry, because you need to leave, in either method, your fabric laying flat, pinned out if you've pinned it, until it is 100% dry. If you unpin it too soon, the blocking's just not going to do the job. Now, you might have noticed some similarities with wet blocking in particular and how you're recommended to care for wool garments. You wash it gently, you squeeze out the water, you lay it flat to dry. So wet blocking is effectively the same as washing your garment, and that's an important thing to remember for some points I'm going to be making a little bit later on. Okay, so that's what blocking is, that's when you do it, that's how you do it. So the next thing that we're going to think about is what happens if you choose not to block your project. Lace projects in particular really do benefit from blocking. They're not going to look as fabulous if they're not blocked. As you're working on a lace project, you'll notice it kind of crumples up and smushes up, and it doesn't really sort of show its holes, its laciness to its full effect as you're working on it. And that's going to stay the same if you don't block it until such a time as you wash the project. And given that most of us don't wash our shawls on a regular basis, that's likely to not happen for lace projects, because a lot of lace are shawls. If you're using lace in a garment, then yeah, you are going to wash it at some point, so that's going to open up the lace anyway, because as I said, wet blocking is very similar to how you would actually wash your garment in order to give it the longest life it can possibly have. So that's point number one. Lace is not going to look its best. Items may change size as well when you do that first wash. So if you have done your gauge swatch and not blocked your swatch, and then you've made your garment and you've not blocked your garment, that first time that you wash it, you might see some changes in the size and the shape of the item. So if you've at least blocked your swatch, you're going to be prepared for those changes when they happen when you wash said item. But if you haven't blocked anything, that could catch you out, could catch you unawares. You might end up with a garment that's too long, you might end up with a garment that's too short, because some yarns will stretch in length, and others will shrink in length when you get them wet, others will stretch in width. So you're just not prepared for those changes if you haven't blocked. If you have blocked, then you're not going to see those changes in the first wash because they've already happened. And yeah, generally the stitch patterns may not be as clear and as pristine as possible up until that first wash if you haven't blocked it. The same with lace, with any other form of knitting stitch pattern, they're just not going to look their best until that first wash, because wet blocking is effectively washing. So do you need to block? Well, no, you don't need to block. It's not a sort of prerequisite of being considered a knitter. You've still made the thing. You can still use the thing. It's just not going to look its best. And you may see some changes when you first wash the item. The one thing that I would say if you're going to choose not to block, and there are reasons why you might choose not to block, and we'll get onto that in a bit, is that blocking does have a purpose. So if you choose not to block, then the consequence of that is that you're not going to see those benefits in the finished item. I personally don't tend to block socks or hats or mittens and mitts unless I need to photograph them for a pattern design, I'm giving them away to somebody as a present, or they're colourwork hats and mittens that might be a little bit snug. When I first try them on off the needles, I might go, oh, actually I might need to block this. But I generally don't wash my hats and mitts and mittens unless they get something on them, which is unlikely, particularly with hats. So they don't really need to be blocked. Particularly, they're going to change shape on my head anyway. They're not going to be getting washed repeatedly, so they're not going to change size very much through washing. Socks, I do wash my socks regularly, so they'll get that polishy stuff happening to them at that point, but in the meantime nobody really looks at my feet all that much, so I can get a wear out of them before I need to wash them, and then it's all blocked and done anyway, so it's fine. I do have sock blockers which I'll use, as I say, for for pattern photographs and for gift knits, and for photographs in general, it's very hard to photograph socks when they're on your own feet unless you've got somebody to help. Sock blockers make that a lot easier, but I don't use them very often because I don't find it necessary. So that's really the thing that you need to think about. Do I think it's necessary to block this item, or can I get away with waiting until I first wash it? So why might you choose not to block? What reasons might you have for that? Well, blocking takes time. You might not have that time before you need to use the item, or you might just want to wear the item straight away and not wait for it to dry. That's fine. That's a perfectly valid reason. Blocking does take time. And you might want to wait to use that time when you do your first wash, having worn the thing a few times. Not a problem. Blocking also takes space, particularly when you're blocking shawls and garments. You need a bit of room. I can block small items in my airing cupboard, but it's hard to block a jumper in the airing cupboards because of wingspan. I can block garments on the floor because I've got a big enough house to be able to find spaces for that. Some garments I can even block on this table when I put the flaps up, but not everybody has got that space that they can use to block things. Certainly not larger things. And you might not physically be able to block for whatever reason. I am in the process of knitting a sweater that includes a couple of blocking stages through the process of knitting it, but I'm not able to block it in the way that I normally would at the moment. I'm had to stand up at the kitchen counter to block the lace panels that go on the tops of the sleeves. That is the first step of this particular project. The reason I can't block it properly, the reason I can't block it in the way I normally would, which involves me crawling around on the floor, is because I fell down the stairs the other day and bruised my coccyx. So my mobility is a little bit impaired at the moment. And that may well be the case for you. You might have a temporary impairment to your mobility, you might have a permanent impairment to your mobility. I wish there was a better word for that. Impairment's not really a great word, is it? But there may be reasons why you can't physically block the thing. Absolutely fine. You might decide not to do that. Not a problem. It's your knitting thing at the end of the day. And as long as you are happy with it, as long as you get the use out of it that you want to get out of it, then it's fine. However, there are some things that really, really, really should be blocked. I'm not saying have to be, I'm saying should. That's because the benefits are greater than not blocking. The benefits from not blocking it. The benefits of blocking greater than not blocking. We've already talked about lace, and that's one thing where I would strongly recommend that you block lace projects. If it's a large shawl and you're struggling for space, you can fold them in half and block them that way. I've blocked shawls like that many times, even in this house where I have got a bit more space. To save a bit more room, be up in a room where I can shut the door and keep the cats off them. I folded shawls in half to block them. That's not a problem. As I say, you can use tables and that kind of thing to block things on if you need to. Some people use beds, but if you don't have a spare bedroom, that's a little bit tricky. But yeah, you can fold things up, and as long as the proportions are right, it's not a problem. So yeah, lace I would strongly recommend that you do block. My one thing that I would, in the strongest terms, advise you to make sure you block, if nothing else, is the swatch. Because as I say, gauge swatches, when they're stated in a pattern, are usually after blocking. So if you don't block your swatch, which is small, so it's going to take less effort and less space to block. So if space is of a premium, then it's not going to take up much room, and you can block a swatch sitting down if you need to. You don't have to crawl around on the floor to do it. You don't have to have a long arm reach to do it. It doesn't take that long to pin it out. If you don't block your swatch, make your garment thinking that you've got the gauge because you measured the gauge without blocking it, and then you come to do that first wash and your garment changes size, you then have a garment that doesn't fit you correctly. Whereas if you block the swatch and then measure the gauge after you've blocked it and use that to inform you about how you're knitting the project, then the first wash isn't going to cause so much of an issue. Yes, okay, you might find if your gauge swatch grows when you block it, that before that first wash your garment is a little bit shorter than you'd really like, because you've considered the fact that it's going to grow once you wash it. But that's only up until the first wash. On the flip side, you might find that your swatch shrinks a bit when you block it, so you knit your garment a bit longer than you normally would, knowing that at that first wash it's going to shrink in length. So okay, those initial few wears may not be quite the fit you're looking for, but the long-term fit of that project is going to be better because you've borne those factors in mind. So that would be my recommendation. If nothing else, block the swatch. Even if you don't block the garment when it's finished, you're going to get a better result that way. I mean, obviously this is only advice, it's only recommendations. You are absolutely free to make your own decisions. But my strong recommendation would be make a swatch and block it before you knit your project, to ensure that the long-term fit is what you want it to be and that the fabric is how you want it to be, the drape and all that kind of thing. But yeah, if you're somebody who's not in a position to be blocking big garments or big shawls or whatever big project you are working on, the swatch is much smaller, it's much easier to block. It takes much less effort, much less time. So you might find that that's something that works for you. Okay, so that's all I have to say this week. If you've enjoyed spending time with me today, by all means like and subscribe and do all the things that YouTubers tell you to do down there. And I will look forward to seeing you in my next video. I aim to put a video up every weekend. It's usually on a Saturday. Sometimes I'm organised enough to get it up on a Friday, and occasionally technology lets me down and it pops up on a Sunday. But I do aim for the weekend every week. Once a month it's a roundup of what I've been working on in the previous month, and in between times it's a bit more project focused or technique based, with videos sort of like this where I waffle at the camera, or where I go through a project or a technique and show you how I've done it. So I look forward to seeing you next week, and in the meantime, happy crafting and bye bye for now.